Compañeros, welcome to another edition of the SQL Data Partners Podcast. This is episode 260, and today we are going to talk about contained availability groups, or CAGs, as Alan Hurt so lovingly. No,
my inner Alan Hurt is already saying, "Don't call him that."
Yeah, but please don't. I use that acronym for something else, and
okay.
You're gonna screw me.
You got double meanings. Huh? Like, hey, we need more letters in the alphabet, I guess, right? To come up with a few more acronyms. Okay, well then I might have to change my show notes link then today. So to help us, we are joined by Mr. Brandon Leach. Welcome, Brandon.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Now, Brandon is a friend of the show. I got to know Brandon over SQL Cruise. Many years ago. Was an East Coaster, then he became a West Coaster, and now he's a Midwesterner.
A Midwest
right?
Coaster.
Yeah,
like Muncie.
I haven't quite found home yet.
All right. Important question. Do you call it soda, pop, or Coke?
Generally Coke.
Okay. Yeah. You're
so
not
you're
a
secretly
native.
a Southerner is what you're saying.
Yeah, exactly.
I was gonna say, yeah.
No. If you're a true Midwesterner, you call it pop.
It is pop all the way.
I do go with Packy though for liquor store.
Man, we escalated, right? We went from the Coke to the hard stuff, right?
Coke is pretty hard if you use the original recipe.
Yeah. He's a Coca-Cola classic guy.
Yeah, exactly. Very classic.
So you've got to go back to you've got to go all the way back to episode 17. In 2015 is the last time I've had you on, Brandon. I can't believe it's been that long. Where did the time go?
He's more dependent.
I don't know, but I actually saw that when going through my emails to try to find a link that worked for the invite. But it was the last time we did this was 2015. That's 8 years ago at this point.
I know. I feel like I was a young man there, had long flowing hair, and Oh
yeah, Carlos looked like a surfer.
I still do.
So obviously one of us has been able to keep it up, right? So good for that. Okay, so contained availability groups, and so I'm not sure what to use for my acronym because I was going to call it CAGs. Again, I saw Alan Hurt's post, and he's like, "Don't do that," and they're like, "Well, you already did it." So I'm like, "You've kind of opened that door." I feel like.
Sorry, but my feeling is simply that I just refer to them as contained availability groups or contained AGs.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, here we go. So so then our show notes for today's episode is now going to be SQLDataPartners.com/contained AGs or SQLDataPartners.com/260. So there we go.
Yep.
So we've got Brandon on, right? So thank you for coming, right? So Brandon, again, a longtime friend, MVP, is a senior member of a database operations team for some, financial company. So he is he likes the pressure cooker is basically the idea, and so he is on. He spoke at SQL Saturday Richmond about this topic, and I was like, hey, I knew I needed to get Brandon on and chat a little bit about this. So before we get into that, however, we do have a couple of shout outs that we want to do. And as always, compañeros, if you are fortunate enough for me to have you misspell your name, I'm sorry, but you get to join the exclusive club of names that I have mispronounced. So
it's not very exclusive. It's a very large membership. I'm sorry, Carlos.
It's exclusive. Yeah. It's exclusive, Eugene.
We've been mispronouncing Eugene's name all along. It's actually Eugen.
Yeah.
Oh, it did take me a while. So, in fact, a funny story there. So back, because actually Eugene's last name, right, when he was first co-hosting, and he was like, "You're overthinking it. Just let it go," right? Like, Meininger. Like, don't think about it. Yeah. So it took us a couple of iterations, right? Probably a couple episodes before I found that finally, came out right. Okay.
I blame the Germans. Anyway.
So show notes for today's episode include Kasfia Ratio. No, Rashid? That's a D. Somebody's okay, man does it. So Kasia Rashid, Renee Leahy, Meg Riot, Sarah Nichols, Amy Wright, James Butler, Steve Perky, Topher Gibbs, Cammie Cox Mossman, Kathy Redford, Olaf Ross, Debbie Henley, Erica Owens, Ashley Tucker, Michelle Willoughby, Deanna Trent, Ebony Atkins, Melissa Edelton, Chris M. Roberts, Will Prater, David Pollard, Timothy S. Doherty, oh man, Lisa Shope, Alex Derhafhanesen. Pretty sure that's right. Carl Duffy, John Morse, Brandon Cooper, Shauna Lamb, Sheila E.G., and Peter L. Thank you, compañeros, for giving us a little shout out, interacting on social media, whatever that might be. We appreciate it. And we appreciate those comments to keep coming in. Okay. So we turn our attention to availability groups. Now, we on the program, we like to try and make things as approachable as possible. So we're gonna so the quick nickel tour, right, Brandon, of availability groups. And if you in theory you really should be kind of somewhat familiar with availability groups, or at least know what you are. This is not the episode to learn about availability groups per se, right? Because we're going to talk about differences and nuances, and it's an expanded, right? This is the second episode. Go back and watch it, or go back and listen to a different episode if you're not familiar. But perhaps for those who don't want to leave and are in their car and they're like, I'm not finding another episode, right? Give us the nickel tour of availability groups as they were introduced in 2016.
How about 2012?
Yeah.
2012?
2012. Yep.
It was 2012?
Yep. 10 years ago.
Man, the Wayback Machine.
It's just about the 10-year anniversary for availability groups. But basically, availability groups are an HADR solution for SQL Server that allows you to have copies of your data on other instances of SQL Server and automatically keep them in sync. That's the 80,000 foot view.
Yep. So I get to have two copies, but I get to point to a single name, and
Correct.
SQL Server will actually move those over, and my applications are none the wiser, right? It's moved where it's reading and writing from, but my applications are like, oh, I'm still pointing to the same place.
Yep. You point to what's called a listener, and it routes you to the appropriate place.
Yep. There you go. So that's the nickel tour. Now, he did say something specific, right? The key word is database, right? I get to keep my database, or I can replicate that database from one instance to another. The challenge becomes when it's not just my database that I need, right? And there are other pieces. Change data capture comes to mind, right? Many of you might have agent jobs that run. You might even have local users, that you need. And what happens when again, because we're in the no judgment zone, you're not using a Windows group. You're not using Active Directory group to manage the security, right? You're giving somebody explicit permission, and then you fail over, right? What happens then? All of a sudden, my availability group is not helping me. The tickets start rolling in.
Yeah, that is very, very true. Your logins start failing too. Right. Because chances are you haven't actually synced up your login. So people had to, in the past, they had to make copies of all their jobs on every replica. They had to make copies of all their logins on every replica. And anytime one of those had to change, you had to change it in multiple places. And that's what contained availability groups aims to solve.
Right. Now, it's still something you have to do, right? Luckily, I feel like, right, the listeners of the SQL Data Partners podcast know that they have a few more tools at their disposal, i.e., the DBA tool stuff to help, sync some of that stuff. So the jobs and logins should not be all that difficult to do anymore. But still, right, when you get that ticket or whatever, right, it's dark 30 and you're failing over, you're doing a patch or whatever, you start getting errors. You don't want to be thinking there, right? You want to be able to react and to do. Correct. So, right, we have these extra pieces that we need. And I don't know. Apparently, this was something that was invited. Now, I guess before we get into that, we have used the word contained before with other SQL Server, another SQL Server feature, right, in contained databases. And it's perhaps not the next version, right? I want to say iteration, right? But again, that idea is the same. Is that, hey, I need to. Everything that I need for this contained database needs to reside in there, right?
Yeah, there are some limitations though too.
Right. So now as we get into the contained availability groups, right? Now it's a little bit as I looked at the feature. I don't want to. I mean, be careful what you ask for, but it was. I was interested. I was like, oh gosh, there's quite a bit of additional components that are needed to make this really happen.
There's also the fact that context in terms of how you connect now becomes extremely important. I mean, if we want to look at kind of, how this is implemented, what it essentially does is it creates extra system databases. So you get a copy of master, you get a copy of msdb, but they're not copies per se. It's a schema only copy.
Yeah.
And so depending upon how you connect, if I connect to the contained availability groups listener and I query for server principals, I'm only going to get the stuff that is known by the contained availability group. If I then connect directly to the system, directly to the instance itself, and I query sys or server principals again, I will not see any of the logins that are part of the contained AG.
Right.
So if I want to do audits and stuff, I now have to have a way of combining that data and querying multiple system tables.
It feels almost that you've created another instance on that server.
Yes, and that's
it kind of feels that way, right? Yeah.
Yep.
Now, so that's a good point, and I guess we'll circle back to the administration, piece there. But there are, so I guess let's talk about. So I create my contained availability group. You just said I create 2 new system databases.
It does that on its own.
It does it on its own, right? That's part of the creation process. But I now have to feed the logins and whatnot. It could be copying over from the the base. I'm going to call it base instance. Is that what we're calling it? What's the? Yeah.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah. I'm copying those over, what have you. What else am I going to? Or I guess let me rephrase. Because we've now said that these are all separate, right? When I want my users, which we've covered, and my jobs, right? I guess I didn't phrase that very well, but you have to create all of that in the contained availability group connecting to that listener. So everything you want to be together has to be created there.
Yep, it's a hard boundary line. If you create a job in there, by being connected to the listener, that job will not appear in SQL Agent on the base instance itself, and vice versa.
Right.
This is why I said earlier that context is extremely important. If you have backup jobs as part of that contained availability group, and you connect to one of the underlying instances, the replica itself, then you will not see that backup history because the job is inside the contained database. You will literally have to query another database that will be in the format of AG name underscore msdb. So
Right. Yeah. So I think it is helpful as you start planning that. You need to then think about, hey, I basically have another instance or a different instance that I'm going to manage. Now, this could be helpful, right? If you know that all of your pieces are going to be contained, then in an essence, is that fair? That base install can largely be ignored in a sense because you're just focused on the contained pieces.
I mean,
right?
I would never say that the base instance config can be ignored. You always want to make sure that's solid.
Sure.
But yeah, if the only stuff you're going to have in it is going to be part of a contained availability group, then yeah, it saves you the trouble of having to synchronize across replicas, at least for logins and jobs. It makes other things not doable. You can't put a contained availability group in a distributed availability group, for example. You cannot use replication. Not that I would tell anyone to use replication today. And log shipping, a contained availability group can be a source, but it cannot be a target.
Right. Destination.
Yep.
Yeah. So with that, yeah, so I admit I have, while we have done some testing there, I don't have one of these in production yet. And so I guess my question is, right, so is the juice worth the squeeze here, Brandon? Right? Because there's a little bit of overhead now that, we've introduced here. Having systems, my availability groups don't fail over all that often. Now, patching and whatnot, a lot of times it's planned. But luckily, right, knock on wood, right, the underlying infrastructure is getting better, right? Solid state, all that stuff. Do you find, I guess, are you using those, or have you seen them in production environments? And have they been? Yeah, is that juice worth the squeeze? Does that make sense?
I've been working with them since pre-release.
Okay.
Since before SQL Server 2022 came out, I've been in there fiddling, and many others have as well. The implementation wasn't necessarily everything we wanted, right?
Right.
I think in its current form, it's not as usable as it could be. What I think will make it more usable is a series of system level views that will help with that context.
Bridge the gap.
I've had to write my own in my own home lab. This rack here, I am actually running a contained availability group that I've used for dev and testing for this sort of stuff. But anyone getting into it is going to have the challenge of building that themselves right now, because there's not much out there. I don't think anyone's really put out queries for it. I hope too soon.
Sure.
So likely most people aren't going to be using it just yet, but maybe in a CU down the road, we'll see something. I don't know of anything on the roadmap, but we'll see what happens. My hope would be that something comes out at some point to give people a DMV or a set of DMVs to kind of do all that context union.
Right.
But for a shop starting off in the scenario you described, it's absolutely perfect.
Sure, that's right. Especially if it can, it's all self-contained, and my availability group will be what I'm using. I guess a couple of the things we should throw out there. So these are available in both standard and enterprise, right?
Yep.
And
let's see,
there was one more feature that I'd mention. It slipped my mind all of a sudden. Let me check my notes.
Actually, I think it might be enterprise only. There was a comment on an Alan Hurt blog post about how It is. Alan mentioned in December that it was EE only.
Oh, really?
That wasn't disclosed during pre-release. So I don't know. Granted, that information might not be totally correct, but it is from Alan, so I kind of expect it to be.
Sure.
Yeah.
No, that's right. That's fair. Yeah.
I honestly don't know off the top of my head. I only run Enterprise or Developer Edition.
Yeah, that's
when you
fair.
are Brandon Leach, there is only certain versions that you run.
He's not going to say which one's in production though. Just to be clear. One of them.
It's not developer production. I'll tell you that.
Brandon's like, nope, Enterprise Edition. You must be this tall to ride the ride. Standard Edition, go home.
Everything in here is Developer Edition, but
yeah, does that server rack keep you warm at night? That's got to put out a lot of BTUs.
Actually, it adds about 10 degrees.
Oh wow!
So it's great in the winter because I don't have to really heat this room much.
Right.
Sure. Yeah, that's funny. Oh yeah, okay. So I guess I saw that and I took it, but at the documentation page on Microsoft actually doesn't have an edition. It just says SQL Server 2022. So which made me assume both versions, but
yeah. So if you are running on Standard Edition, give it a try, see if it works. It may not work.
That'll be a question to answer.
Yeah, something we didn't mention around, why do we have the separate databases, and why doesn't it just updated in master and msdb?
Sure.
It sounds like this is the impetus behind this is, well, if I have availability group 1 on a server A and an availability group 2 on a server B, and then I could have a server C be a replica for availability groups 1 and 2, both of those being contained. And now they could have different logins. They could have different agent jobs. They could have different objects in master and not foul everything up.
So there's a couple things on that front. One, it makes tearing them down a lot harder. If you've decided that you're going to remove one replica from the contained AG in favor of another, right? Second, in that scenario, how do you separate between these logins and their password hashes belong only on as part of, or only on this contained availability
server
group,
A,
but shouldn't be over on this other server that's not a member of that as well? Right.
Yeah. And if you have any sort of overlapping SQL login names that are intended to be different, I have AG user on one, AG user on another. They're not intended to be the same. They may have different passwords. Then you wouldn't be able to organize them otherwise. So there's a method to the madness. Being able to do cross everything views. Especially as you get to those more complex scenarios, that would be really interesting to see.
So here's the
we're saving Microsoft's saving ourselves from ourselves, right? Yeah.
Somewhat, yes. The other thing is though, so it's interesting because there are cases in which you can actually access the stuff in the data in a contained availability group from outside the contained availability group. 3-part naming and vice versa. I can actually reach out from within the contained availability group to any other database if I know the name of that database.
Right. And if you have the permissions.
It won't show me if I query sys.databases, but if I know that database and I have permissions, I can do that.
Yeah, so this isn't intended to be a security feature where you're prohibiting access. It's more of a matter of niceties.
Sure.
If you have the access, you can get to that data, even if you're within the contained availability group. So it's not truly contained in the sense of you're isolated from everything else.
Which then kind of goes back to Brandon's, comment earlier about, there will be some, or hopefully, right, we'll see some management views or something that would help kind of tie those together a little bit easier, right? Because it is, it's not necessarily from a security perspective meant to be Let's put up walls here.
Honestly, my main concern is auditing and automated management, right? Think about the audit. You go and you query every instance and you say, give me, you know, all the sysadmins on every server. Well, okay, that's great, but you missed all the ones in the contained AG, right?
Sure.
So now you don't have an accurate list. You have to iterate over every database named _master.
But now I guess so. Am I disconnecting there? Because in my mind, I guess I thought of it basically as so my listener name in my mind becomes an instance, right? That I have to add to my audit. Is that not fair? Or
ideally, yes. However, we just talked about the fact that you can reach outside of the contained availability group.
Okay.
Right. So you may have unintended consequences of someone being able to access something and cross a boundary that they shouldn't.
Gotcha.
So, yeah, you can treat the listener as an instance, but it's two separate servers underneath that also potentially serve another purpose. And you have to bring all this together and cross-check it.
Sure, but from an audit perspective, right now, basically in that scenario, right, I've got, I have an availability group. I just now have 3 servers I got to query.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah, essentially, yeah.
Well, hold on.
But
I understand.
Go ahead.
You said like sysadmin. So are you saying that I can give somebody am I able to give someone server level permissions within this master database, or they only have permissions within the specific user database and such? Do you know what I'm saying?
They should only have permissions within the contained availability group, but if they also have permissions outside and they're not aware of context, there's potential for them to accidentally take an action against the instance.
Got it. Yeah.
As opposed to the database and the contained AG.
I was just wondering if there's some way to have like stealth sysadmin accounts that people can't see. Because that'd be scary.
I mean, you could do a lot of stuff with stored procedures and triggers and all sorts of stuff, but you really have to put effort into making it happen.
Yeah, fair.
And chances are someone else is going to raise a security concern.
Yeah. So that was my other point that I was alluding to earlier. So when you create these availability groups, they have to be either contained or not contained. There's no switching, right? So it's on the creation process, and you're kind of, I wouldn't say stuck, right? But if you decide you want to change your mind, then you're destroying that group and you're going to create another one.
Honestly, even if you could change your mind, I would never suggest doing that. I would always suggest net new in this case, since the internal plumbing does involve the creation of additional system databases.
So I know that you were working, this kind of goes back to our standard question, whether it's supported on standard, because one of the questions I had was, okay, so in standard, I can only have one listener, right? I can have multiple databases or multiple availability groups, but only one listener. When I create multiple contained availability groups, I guess that might be a question of, would that be supported then in standard? Because I need another listener, right? Right?
Correct. You would need another listener in that scenario. Contained availability groups require a listener.
Right.
If you don't have that, they simply do not work.
Gotcha. Okay. So yeah, that's fine. I guess I will go back. So you had mentioned there were 2 things on the wizard that you wanted to talk about. Maybe we just talk through those really, quickly.
Yep.
And that might be sufficient for our purposes.
Yeah. I mean, the 2 things are that it's possible when you tear down, if you're going to tear down and rebuild a contained availability group that you can reuse the existing system databases. You don't lose everything, right? But that's a checkbox you have to specify when you rebuild it. The other thing is you specifically have to mark it as a contained availability group.
Right.
Same way you would pick a basic availability group.
Right. So by default, basic, you want contained, you got to click the button. Now, going back to that system, let me just make sure that I understand. So I have my availability group up, and I'm going to decommission, or I'm going to take it down. There's an option for me to say, hey, by the way, save this for later because I'm going to reuse it. Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that when you tear it down, it won't necessarily delete those system databases. But yes, you should take every opportunity, back them up, try to save them so that you can reuse them and not have to reload all your logins, jobs, etc.
Gotcha. Okay, I guess that's it. So we'll sweep that under the covers in terms of that's just SQL Server magic, matching up my system databases again.
Yep.
Right? Or is there something specific I have to do to be like, hey, SQL Server, I've already created one of these. I want you to reuse those.
When you rebuild the availability group, you will specify an option. In the wizard, it's a checkbox and tell it to use the existing system databases.
Oh, very nice.
And it will say, AG name _ master. Great.
I see that already. Okay.
Yeah. So that
now
will,
are those? So we
time.
talked about the databases, right? But am I going to? No, that's. Yeah, that's interesting. I guess so. In my mind, I need to go play with that now because all of a sudden in my mind I'm like, if it can be reused, then shouldn't the base install or the base instance know about that AG master database? And so now all of a sudden I'm.
Yeah, now all of a sudden you're getting confused because now you've
down
got
the
two
rabbit hole
separate master databases.
No, that's right. That's right. Yeah.
So.
Okay. Well, very good. Well, thanks, Brandon. I guess any last thoughts? So I guess, and you'll forget, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth here, but what I feel like you're saying is, hey, these are going to get a whole lot better. No promises, but if and when we get some more management components in there, then all of a sudden contained AGs are going to be better or going to be a thing.
Yeah.
Is that fair? Yeah.
I'd say that's very fair.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. Very good. Last thoughts for or questions for Brandon? Okay. Yeah. Can we do SQL Family?
Let's do it.
So Brandon, how did you first get started with SQL Server?
Oh boy. That was going way back to the aughts. I mean, well, technically, I know I had some experience with it in the late 90s, a little bit. But it was, I was working for a residential treatment center for adolescent girls, as doing IT there, and they helped me out, learn, get some experience. But it wasn't really until about 2008, really, or 2006 when I really started using it heavily. In 2008, when I really started taking care of DBA duties. I inherited a bunch of SQL servers. No one was maintaining them, and it became my job.
Hot potato. That sounds like a classic.
Hot potato. Figured I should actually learn about this thing.
Yeah. There you go. So now, what would you do if you had to change careers?
At this point?
Indeed.
Prepare for the inevitable divorce.
I
mean, I made such a career there. To go into a different career outside of like tech, at least, would be, even within tech, it would be very much a giant step down. And You know, that's a huge adjustment for a family.
Sure.
So,
okay. Well, so assuming you can make the same amount of money.
Oh, same amount of money, it wouldn't be a problem.
So what would you do?
What would I do outside of tech?
Yeah, if you had to change careers.
I'd probably go back to being a roadie. So
that doesn't sound like work, but
it's more work than you know.
Is that right? Okay. Well, there you go.
Yeah, you get very little sleep. You're constantly left with like dollar menu McDonald's. You might shower once a week if you're lucky.
Wow.
And you are the first one up and the last one to get to bed.
There you go. And you
Every
want to
night.
jump back into it. Man, there we go. Okay. Now, what's one thing that can instantly make your day better?
One thing that can instantly make my day better. Mac and cheese.
Hey, there we go. Hey, now, does it have to be homemade, or are you okay with the Kraft mac and cheese?
Kraft will make me sad. But no, you find me a good mac and cheese, I'm happy.
Yeah. Oh, that's right. Panera. You're a Panera guy.
Panera's mediocre. It's okay, but it's not the best. I've had way better. The mac and cheese at 10 Barrel in Portland is wonderful. Absolutely wonderful.
There we go. Now, what's your go-to song when you need to boost your mood?
Oof. Well, since I listen to death, doom, black metal, and thrash, I'm not sure you want the answer to that.
Bro, frankly, all of that sounds uplifting.
Yeah, I mean, Toxic Waltz by Exodus is wonderful.
Okay, if you say so. Okay, so now, do you have a bucket list?
So yes, I do have a bucket list. Going to Norway, getting to see the fjords. That's high up there. Going to some of the European metal festivals is high up there. You know, I've been lucky enough to hit a lot of my bucket list items. You know, career-wise, always looking to do more. But I mean, the real bucket list items I have these days are around my kids, actually. Giving them, making sure that they can achieve as many of their goals, both professional, personal, as possible.
Very cool.
So,
Kevin, our last question for you. No, Brandon, our last question for you today. What's your favorite ice cream topping?
I generally go with cookie dough ice cream with peanut butter cups and Reese's Pieces on top and some fudge. Or syrup. Chocolate syrup. There we go.
Okay, man. That sounds really good, actually.
Yeah, and really unhealthy.
Yeah, I was gonna say. I can imagine. Awesome. Well, Brandon, thanks so much for chatting with us today. We do appreciate it. Glad that we can have you back after 200 and some odd episodes. You know, to have you back and chat a little bit. Should folks want to connect with you, how can they do so?
So they can find me either on Twitter at SQL Server Nerd or on LinkedIn.com/in/SQL Server Nerd. And my email is just Brandon at SQL Server Nerd.
There we go.
Nice.
And Eugene?
Oh man, you can find me on Twitter at SQLGene. And you can find me on TikTok, but it makes me sad, so I'm not going to tell you where.
Okay. And Mr. Kevin?
You can find my details in the contained msdb on the replica instance. So just go check in there. It's in there.
That's right. One of those tables in there, right? Compañeros, you can connect with me on LinkedIn at Carlos L. Chacon. If you're connecting, please let me know you're listening to the podcast. I do appreciate it. We still do have, if you made it this far, right? And we still do have podcast T-shirts available at SQLDataPartners.com/T-shirt if you'd like to get yours. And so you can check it off your bucket list there as well, right? Because I know most of you have that on your bucket list. Thanks again for tuning in, right? Thanks, Brandon, for being here. We do appreciate it. Good stuff. And compañeros, we'll see you on the SQL Trail. Bye now.
Bye.
SQL Data Partners.